Head in the Wall Street Journal recommended that they start by tossing the Federal Communications Commission, the FTC, the SEC, the Department of Agriculture, the Postal Service. Yeah, give it to UPS. Give it to, give it to anybody except them. The Labor Department, HUD, the Interior Department, the VA. Yeah, vets need the money. Give it directly to them. And, of course, the EPA, just to name a few. Now, keep in mind the Department of Education is also very much on the cutting board.
Did you hear that last part that kind of slipped in? Yeah, cut the VA. Just give the money to the veterans. Sounds so simple, doesn't it? It's not. And we're going to discuss that today right here on Line with Vote Vets. I am your host, Fred Wellman. I'm a retired Army officer, spent 20 years in service, including 4 combat tours. It's all that junk back there. So glad to have you guys join us today for this live. This is such an important issue, and the volume has been getting louder and louder. As you see, that was Sean Hannity just 2 weeks ago, going with this opinion piece that appeared in the Wall Street Journal that was a suggestion list for, you can show that, JJ, that op-ed, the suggestion list for the Department of Government Efficiency, I think they called it, that ridiculous thing from Vivek and Elon. And in that op-ed, they slipped in like a 2-sentence thing. It said, yeah, cut the VA. And of course, then Hannity picked it up. So Vivek Ramaswamy has said that their first recommendation that they're going to go after will be programs that are not currently funded by congressional authorization. Now, look, we're not going to go down deep into why something might not be congressionally authorized right now. There's a lot of good reasons, from systems that they've just renewed every year, budgets when they do these CRs where they just renew the contract. It's just a mess. But let's look at this chart. I can throw that chart up. That chart, look at that top line, that's from the Office of Management Budget, OMB. That top really long line of $119 billion in fine print says veterans healthcare. $119 billion is on the target list of the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, from Elon and Vivek. That's a big number, y'all. And this was followed after that story. Not long after, this crazy story came out from The Economist that kind of set the veterans community absolutely on fire when they said that our care, that the benefits for veterans have become overly generous. And the article goes on in depth about how mysterious things have happened. Like, for example, this is going to shock you guys, for those who aren't paying attention, for reasons they didn't go into in the story in The Economist, the cost of veterans health care and the number of veterans needing benefits has gone up dramatically since 2000. And they didn't say why in the article. I mean, does anybody know why we may have more veterans needing health care and long-term support and benefits since the year 2000? I mean, maybe the longest war in American history, perhaps, that over 6 million people served overseas and within the military over. Yeah, that might drive up veterans health care costs, especially when you got guys like me who, when they only have 3 tours, is a low number. And so we're seeing these kind of just this chatter. And the one thing I've learned being in DC, and our friends at Task and Purpose talk about that chatter, is if you've worked in DC or you even follow politics remotely, you know that at a certain point, there's a reason that this chatter is occurring, that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And what they're doing, so, I mean, think about what they've said. They've literally said, let's cut the whole VA. Well, that's ridiculous. Congress would never allow that to happen. My God, Abraham Lincoln himself is the guy who created the Department of Veterans Affairs, what they called the VA back then, the Veteran Administration back then. So they said, oh, we're going to cut. Well, now they can say, hey, look, that's crazy. We're not going to cut the VA. No, we're going to just shave 119 million or billion, excuse me. You see how that works? It's a classic Washington thing. Set expectations really high of outrageousness. And then when you offer a compromise, it's a compromise. So what we want to do here at Vote Vets is get online today, talk to some experts and some actual veterans who use the VA, have worked at the VA, and can explain to you why this is outrageous, why this is dangerous and what it will mean to veterans and really to the larger picture of what it means to America and the promises we've made to those who served. So I want to get on with the show. We're going to invite our first guest. It's our friend Kayla Williams. Kayla is a U.S. Army veteran. We served the 101st Airborne together at the same time, although we didn't hang out much back then in Iraq, but we did. We were in Iraq at the same time. Kayla has gone on to do a lot of really important things. Most recently, she was the Assistant Secretary at the Department of Veterans Affairs for Intergovernmental Affairs and Public Affairs. Kayla, welcome to On the Line with Vote. It's great to have you, sister.
Thanks for having me back, Fred. Really appreciate it.
So, yikes, right? I mean,
Yikes.
I mean, how seriously, I mean, you're in DC. How seriously should we take this chatter? I mean, just in your view, having worked in VA and politics, I mean, there's a lot of chatter all of a sudden, isn't there?
There is. And I think your point that members of Congress probably wouldn't stand for wholesale shuttering of VA is a really good point. I mean, we saw the effort a few years back to modernize VA facilities, which would involve closing some of the oldest and most outdated ones where in areas where vets don't live in particular. And members of Congress wouldn't even go with that, right? Like He wants to say a VA in my district shut down on my watch. So I think it's unlikely that they are going to vote to explicitly shutter VA. However, they can absolutely allow it to continue on this path of death by 1,000 cuts by trying to push more vets out into private sector care, which is more expensive, is lower quality, and folks are less happy with. Like we know from the research that veterans are actually very happy with their VA care overall, and that VA has better outcomes, which is super important. For the 6 million or so veterans who use VA on an annual basis, we need that care. For the 9 million or so total enrolled veterans, they may not be in there all the time, but need that as a backstop. And this is critically important care. It's also important that VA is a backstop for the entire U.S. healthcare system in times of crisis, in natural disasters, in pandemics, in times when the existing healthcare infrastructure is inadequate to meet the needs of others. VA can actually step in and help in other ways. VA does a tremendous amount of research that ends up benefiting all of us. And we can't, as a country, afford to lose that. Vets like me rely on VA for high quality, evidence-based, culturally competent care. And it would be a massive mistake to put that at any further risk by, tossing around these crazy ideas about just, it's only being appropriated. It's the authorization is lapsed. Like that's absurd. Yeah. Some of Ramaswamy's other ideas just fire half of government employees based on their last number of their social security number. Yeah. Can you imagine you know what? Who cares if it's a really high quality cardiac surgeon?
Right.
Out. Like this is nobody who runs a legitimate business would ever make decisions that way. It's absurd.
And it's not a real department. Let's be honest. It's just a clown show right now. Things. It's a meme. Now they're creating a Doge caucus that I saw Ro Khanna even joined it, and Jared Moskowitz has joined it on the Democratic side. So they are talking about this, and I think it's smart to have us involved. But for us as veterans, the problem I think we've always seen is that this could happen. It's interesting when this came out, Kayla. One of our military reporter friends, I won't name him for privacy purposes, one of the longtime Department of Defense journalist, but Pentagon journalist, he texted me. He said, "Fred, I saw your post about these cuts." He goes, "I remember talking to Eric Shinseki when he was the Secretary of VA back under Obama, when the war was still going on." And Shinseki told this reporter, he goes, "The thing is, I'm afraid for the day when they decide that veterans care is too expensive, right? That beyond the war, like when he said, when the war is over, I fear for the day when and that's what, so a lot of us, since the war ended officially a couple years ago, 3 years ago, we've sort of been waiting for the realization that a lot of money goes into taking care of us. We call that the long tail of war, right? Don't we? And it doesn't, frankly, it gets more expensive as we get older, doesn't it?
That's right. When you mentioned, why do you think costs are going up? And you said because of these wars, it's like, well, and because Vietnam veterans are aging, and that care is more expensive as they near end of life, with conditions caused or exacerbated by exposure to toxic chemicals like Agent Orange, that
Yep.
the U.S. government exposed them to. We have a moral obligation to provide care for these folks. And when you talk about that long tail, the final surviving dependent of a Civil War veteran only passed on in the past 5 years. Like a 90-year-old Civil War vet fathered a couple of children who were unable to work and were getting a pension for a very, very long time. If you want to cut the cost, stop going to war.
That's it.
That's the answer. You can't go to war and then come around and decide, like, actually, looks really expensive, so let's give our billionaire buddies tax breaks by cutting veteran care and benefits. That's not the answer.
And we've talked about this for a while. Project 2025 had a lot of things in it. We did a whole show. That's a matter of fact, it's the first time you and I did a show together. Was talk about Project 2025's Veterans Affairs cuts. They talk about things like concurrent receipt being cut. They talk about things like, of shortening the time that doctors see our veterans to match more like the military care. They talk about those kind of little trims. But when you talk about a concurrent receipt trip, can you explain concurrent receipt to folks who don't understand what the hell we're talking about?
I try. It's a little tricky. In general, the government doesn't want folks to double dip and to get benefits for the same thing from more than one department. So if somebody has a military disability check and a VA disability check at the same time, they might be offset. You can't get them at the same time for the same condition. And then there are a lot of like kind of exception sets. So my spouse, for example, because he's combat wounded, he's able to get combat related special compensation. So he kind of is able to get both at the same time because he was retired due to the severity of his injuries, and VA gives him. But it's deeply confusing, and you have to really like dig into the weeds and try to understand it. And over time, there have been more efforts to say like, hey, stop. This isn't double dipping. These are looked at in different ways. If you, served in the military for 20 years, if you have retired, if you sustain injuries and you are getting military retirement for that work, and then you separately are disabled and VA considers you to have service-connected disabilities, like those should be considered separately. The major VSOs, veteran service organizations, their major priority has been to actually expand folks' ability to get concurrent receipt with the Major Richard Starr Act, not to cut it. So it does get confusing and tricky for folks. But, I guess the short way to say it would be, if you worked at any normal civilian job for 20 years and you're getting a pension, and you also sustain an injury doing that job and are getting Social Security disability, you wouldn't want somebody to say like, oh, you know what, we're going to cut your pension now that you're getting Social Security, right? Like you have separately earned that. That's
and I'm living proof. I'm a retired. I did 22 years in the Army. I'm military retired. Obviously, my body got beat up from that, but I earned a military retirement check from that of X amount. Generally half your base pay at time of retirement. I also ended up earning 100% disability from the VA. I get to go and have back surgery in 2 weeks because it's awesome. Flying those helicopters is actually bad for your back. Who knew? So once I first got 50% disability, that's when concurrent. So up to 50% disability rating from the VA, it actually concurrent receipts with your Army. So you can never top out. So whichever is higher will adjust to make that the same amount. So for me, when I became 100% retired, I actually got my full VA disability because I'm 100% disabled, and I get my full military retirement check. Now, it sounds like a lot of money, right? Full VA, about 100% is about $3,700 a month, if or so, depending on your disability and your dependents. And then military retirement is based on your rank. I had a dear friend write me right away when this first came out, and he said one of his biggest fears was losing concurrent receipt. He said, for me, Fred, that's the difference between being homeless and not homeless. Right? The $3,700 a month is not a lot of money I don't know how many people can live on just $3,700 a month. It's not enough to live. And so if you lose your military retirement or one or the other, it's going to hurt a lot of people. And what's really funny about that is it's not a huge number. In that article from The Economist, they said only 1 in 4 disabled veterans earn 100% disability. So it's actually relatively few of us are 100% contrary to popular belief. I guess the biggest thing is one thing we didn't touch on too, Kayla, and I do want to talk about with the VA is there's a lot people don't realize how many American doctors have trained in the VA. It's my understanding that the VA hospital system is one of the largest training grounds for many of our doctors in America, isn't it?
Right. I don't have it memorized for each field. It's something like 70%, 80%, but it's doctors, it's also nurses, it's other healthcare specialties. A lot of folks end up doing at least one rotation in a VA hospital. And so to think of eliminating that, it's ridiculous. It is absolutely one of the biggest places that medical professionals get training. And I cannot imagine how foolish it would be to get rid of that opportunity for them to learn as part of their training that then goes on to serve all Americans.
Yeah. Talk to me about, and you're a veteran and you've served for a long time in and out of the VA and our government. And I mean, the long-term effects, I think, one of the things I tell a lot of folks, we have these conversations is, anytime you tweak veterans care or military rank or pay, like these talks are having about like reviewing generals for them being, we had this conversation in the last Vote Vets, on the live Vote Vets with General Paul Eaton, that this idea of essentially politicizing the military quite a bit, there's a longer term effect to that, right? Because it takes 20 years to make a colonel, right? It took me, I think Bird colonel is 24, 25 years. Generals are 30 years to make a general. Decisions you make now, the good people who don't join, is going to affect us 30 years from now. So I guess what I'm trying to frame is there's a long-term effect for our national security by screwing with the VA, isn't there?
There certainly could be. I mean, honestly, this is a longer and more complicated discussion. I think most 18-year-olds are not thinking about, might I need VA care when I'm 65? But but we do. I think it's an important promise that we must keep ethically and morally. Another thing that we really need to think about when you're talking about some of those costs and what are the long-term decisions about costs, another angle to that is if you make it harder for vets to get basic care, preventive care, early care, that does not save money, right? Think of it this way. A flu shot is not that expensive, right? But treating an 80-year-old veteran with the flu is much more expensive. So there's a real incentive to actually make it easier to get more veterans into VA and get the care that they need as soon as possible instead of letting things fester, right? I mean, this can be played out in many other angles. Think about somebody with diabetes, get them in, get their diabetes managed under control, get them insulin, get them what they need, or don't let it get controlled. And then they end up with an amputation related to the diabetes, and then they need surgery and they need wheelchair. Like, we don't want to make it harder for people to get healthcare. This is to me blindingly obvious. We want folks to be able to get basic healthcare, and it is in fact cheaper in the long run to give people high quality, evidence-based, culturally competent care in as convenient a way as possible.
And one of the things that makes me nervous in the Project 2025 idea that they floated was the idea that the only things that VA would see veterans for were items that were directly related to their military service injuries. So, for example, unless it's on your disability list as something you happen from the military, then you, like you said, let's say onset of type 2 diabetes, because once we leave the military, we tend to gain weight. And maybe we do have those problems later on, but one of the ideas they're floating from the heritage, that little Project 2025 plan, was to just get care. Well, that means that a veteran's going to need health insurance separate from VA health insurance, right? They're going to have to go on the ACA, and it's basically, for me, it felt like a backdoor just to force veterans to make a choice between VA or a private healthcare coverage, because no one's going to want to go to a entirely different insurance system, if you will, for each different thing you have. It's not, and
it leads
crazy,
to worse
right?
Outcomes. Like, it's very, very clear that if you are getting fragmented care, your healthcare outcomes are worse than if you're getting integrated care. You need to be able to go to one doctor who can see your entire health record, who is able to make sure that your drugs aren't going to interact badly with one another. It is simply leads to better health if you're able to get all of your healthcare in one integrated healthcare system.
Yeah, and it's key. And again, I see there's a guy yelling in all caps. Thank you for that. They're not coming from veterans healthcare. They are coming from veterans. We're not lying about this. You know what? We know this because they've said they are in Project 2025, and the head of Project 2025 is now was just nominated to run the OMB. Okay, so save me the freaking all caps. The truth is, they are coming for us in some form. They're going to come for our healthcare. They're going to come for our benefits. There's a reason The Economist ran an article, right, that says, veterans benefits are very generous. I mean, you'd have to be asleep at the wheel for the last freaking 9 years to not know how these guys work, right? Kayla, you were there. You were there at the beginning of this administration. You came in at the beginning of this administration when kind of pick up the pieces for the last one. There was chaos in the VA when you guys joined. And a lot of these kind of things were happening when you guys came in and tried to take over, didn't you?
Yeah. And they want to privatize VA. I mean, that is very, very clear. My opinion is that VA is on the target list in part because VA works so well. And they don't want an example of a government agency that serves its constituents so well. That gives lie to the entire game that they're playing. Yeah. And that's why they want to starve VA and mismanage VA so that they can say, see, look, government doesn't work. Let's take apart government. When you have an example of government working really quite well overall, that makes it harder for them to make that argument. I want to be really clear. I'm not claiming that VA is perfect, that VA shouldn't be continually trying to improve, that there aren't individual VA employees who make terrible decisions and like pockets of problems. All of those things are true. We need a strong Congress that's going to perform its oversight role. We want to continue to make VA better and better and better. But we have seen through time that in study after study after study, VA outperforms non-VA as a system of care. And I've used regular health insurance. I've had military healthcare. I've had VA healthcare. I choose to go to VA because I get better care from doctors who understand what burn pits are, who know what military sexual trauma is, who understand my military specific exposures, who, to your point earlier, take the time to have long appointments with me and like really engage with me instead of get in, get a throat swab, see if you have strep, get out the door, right? Like that's not my experience at VA at all. I have a great experience at VA. And I would rather see the rest of the U.S. healthcare system move closer to VA than the other way around.
Yeah. And again, it has worked, and it does work for a lot of veterans. And let's turn to that aspect. Let's go ahead. I want to bring our next guest in, and you can stay on with us because we kind of talk about the macro part and the larger part of ideas of what the VA means and what the healthcare means. But let's talk about what the personal effect is on veterans. So Bob Crandall, why don't you join us? JJ, bring Bob in. So Bob Crandall is a U.S. Army Special Forces veteran. Okay, so he's a badass. He is a Vietnam veteran, and you're a badass, Bob. Don't tell us otherwise. So it's once again, we have an all-Army show for you folks, because that's what we do. Sorry, JJ, our Air Force guy. Bob, welcome to On Live Vote. It's great to have you, brother.
Thanks for having me.
Bob, tell us a little bit about your service, man.
Went into the Army out of high school in '67, volunteered for Nam. Spent a tour and a half there, got out, didn't really do well in civilian life. So I ended up, after about 4 years, going back in, so re-enlisted. About the time things were coming to a head, we'd already pulled out of Vietnam, but North Vietnamese came down, as we know, and took over the rest of the country in '75. At that time, I was in Korea and the infantry, 2nd Infantry. And when Saigon fell, about shortly after that, I was playing combat football and broke my neck. From there, I ended up in the VA system when I got retired from the Army. So I'm retired, disabled. Went into rehab on the spinal unit at Heinz VA.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to scale things from the cost now versus what it was back then. Instead, I had a large number of non-vets at that point in the VA system. I went into a spinal unit. This was 75, so we had officially been out of Vietnam in 2 years, for 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
A spinal, 4 different wards, 60 beds apiece, 240 bed ward spinal unit, full to the brim. So I can't imagine what the cost these days would be of that. However, as we've been going, I've been trying to compare what I got back then to, what's going on now.
Yeah.
Anyhow, since then till now, I've received good, excellent care from the VA, various different spinal units from Milwaukee to Seattle, Portland, and integrated care, as you've been discussing, how it's so important to get the whole thing put together for you. It's not like all of us know how to go out there and find a doctor who can put together our complicated situations.
Yeah. You're in Billings. So if I can interrupt, Bob, you're in Billings, Montana, right?
Correct.
I mean, could you even find the kind of care you need for your long-term care that, from your injuries in that area? Would it be easy for you to find healthcare in some of these places?
So spinal cord injuries are rare in this area.
Yeah.
But we're around. And so my civilian friends, they don't get the care that I get from the VA. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
They have to manage their own care. They don't do what the VA does for me. Recently, in association, I believe, with the PACT Act, although it might have been introduced prior to that, I get what's called home-based primary care, where I get an entire care team that comes in from a primary care, in this case, nurse practitioner, and then I get PT, OT, a social worker. I even have a pharmacist. I spent an hour on the phone with a pharmacist trying to manage my own medication to make sure that we can deal with. So I've been a spinal cord injured person now since 75, so almost 50 years. And so I have complications, and they're not common, but they're complicated. And so I don't know how. Okay, to go back now, you asked how would I get this in the civilian sector. Talking with my friend 2 days ago, who's dealing with some bladder issues that are similar to mine, and we're trying to compare notes and figure out, okay, how does he get the care and attention that I get from my coordinated team that gives me the support. At the top, you're talking about this idea of, okay, they're going to cut this amount and just give it to the veterans and say, here, go get your own care. I don't know that I'm college educated and been around. I don't know that I got the wherewithal to have managed the care that I get from the VA, which provides me a comprehensive, extensive support system of medication and income. And beyond that, a new, for me, aspect, I lived independently up until, say, 15 years ago. I lived on my own as a quad. Through the support system I got to get good rehab, good training, and be able to take care of myself because they promoted me all along. All of that the whole time supported by the VA. Yeah. So I can't imagine where I would be without the VA. But, I was talking with you earlier about the veterans that I hang with here in support groups, whether it's PTSD groups, specifically through mental health out of the VA, or groups that we put together because we're trying to survive the cutbacks, and that happened concurrent with the COVID event.
Right.
So we get together on our own. But we've got veterans from Vietnam, from Desert Storm, from all of the events that occurred after 9/11, trying to keep track of what each one of us are doing. I don't want to get off track here. I'm trying to stay with us. The point being that we're trying to balance between care in the community that's available to us now because of the PACT Act and massaging the system over the years to try to figure out the most efficient way to take the funds that are being given to the VA to try to provide care. Do we do it in the VA system? Do we do it in the care in the community? Because it's public knowledge. You guys have all covered and followed how, what happens down in Arizona at the VA. Yeah. Those are the big headline events.
Yeah.
But they're learning events, and so the VA is getting it better, and they've gotten it better. And I can't imagine a civilian system, civilian hospitals. There are two major hospitals in Billings. Montana has a population of veterans, approximately 12% of the population of Montana are veterans. Yeah. So Billings, which is a city of, let's say, 120,000, there's 15,000 veterans. If you took us all out of the VA clinic and sent us over, we're not like we're all disabled.
No.
But anyway, sorry.
It's a big number. No, you're okay. Well, while you're doing that, Bob, and you on your side, Kayla, you've got special needs in your home too. Your husband is brain injured, I believe, and so you've been dealing with. You need special care even for yourself, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say, I think Bob's point is fantastic. Is there even enough capacity in the civilian sector to absorb another 6 million patients? We've seen record numbers of rural hospital closures, in particular, in the aftermath of COVID. Yep. Where are the vets going to go? It's this big myth that you can just send us all into the private sector and it's there and ready to absorb us. And that's not necessarily true. They may not be there to be able to absorb us. And VA is able to help many of us with things like telehealth. And there's a draft bill on the Hill right now that I think is bonkers that says that VA isn't going to be allowed to let veterans use telehealth if it's there. And instead of community care, this makes no sense to me. I would rather, to be quite honest, talk to a VA provider in another state than be forced to drive to see a provider near me that doesn't know what they're talking about. But yeah, my spouse, as you mentioned, sustained a penetrating traumatic brain injury in Iraq, and through TRICARE, he initially tried going to see a civilian doc through the Johns Hopkins system. It's kind of confusing. But in the DC area, that's one of the options available to you if you're a retiree. Yeah. And when he went there, the doctor was like, I don't know anything about blast injuries. You should just go to VA. I don't like this. You seem really, this seems complicated. You have what's going on with you? No, you should just go to VA.
Right.
And same, I've never had a civilian provider screen me for military sexual trauma. Right. Much less be able to then step up and say, oh, you have a trauma history. Here's how we can make your visit more comfortable. Here's what we can do to make sure that you are going to have a positive experience. And tell us what accommodations you need. Tell us what we can do to make this comfortable for you. That's not happening in the civilian sector because they don't even know the term MST, much less know to screen for it. They don't know to say, hey, based on your exposure to burn pits, maybe you should get a mammogram a little bit younger than other women with your lack of family history. Yeah. These are the things that vets will lose if they continue down this path of trying to push us out into the private sector, because some of their buddies are going to be able to make more money if they've destroyed the direct care system, which has these amazing things like Bob mentioned. The spinal cord injury system of care in VA is what I've heard unmatched, just unmatched.
As far
Is that
as
what you're
I,
seeing, Bob? Man, for that, it's got to be a lifesaver for you, Bob. And they understand the injuries because of so many of them, right? There's a volume of them from our line of work that doesn't come from civilian side, or does it?
yes. But one thing that you mentioned, you had the choice to go to care in the community, and that's important because there's going to be times where care in the community is going to be better.
Yeah.
Because the VA isn't able also to cover because it's overloaded.
Right.
And for some specialties, right? Like VA is not going to, VA doesn't do labor and delivery because there's no NICU, because VA can only care for veterans by and large, with some very small, exceptions. So, yeah, absolutely. Like, let me go and deal with that sort of thing in a community setting that's going to have a NICU present. Like, great, that's better. Absolutely. There are going to be some cases like that. But if we weaken the direct care system too much, it could collapse. If you pull too much money away from VA and send too many people into community care, you're going to start losing VA doctors, and eventually it's called a death spiral. I'm not making this term up. You can Google it. It's used in other settings as well. But many of us are really worried that VA is approaching this kind of like totality where it's going to enter a death spiral. And members of Congress aren't going to have to vote to close it. It's just going to start to collapse. This is the moment when all of us need to be holding the line to protect the direct care system that helps veterans like me and you, Fred, and Bob, because the civilian sector is not able to provide the type of specialty care that we need and that is going to allow us to thrive, to age in our homes where we want to age with the types of supports that Bob was talking about. This is a system worth saving.
And Bob, add to that, Bob. I mean, you are
just exactly along the lines. The spinal unit, the Seattle VA, Puget Sound VA, they are struggling right now because of this exact conflict within the VA between funds for community care and direct care. And you can't get the spinal care, and there's other specialties, as you alluded to. And those funds are having to be fought over. So plans for long-term care for spinal care people, long-term care for all veterans, those funds are on the line already. And there's no place for us to go sometimes. And so I've had to balance some care that I've received. Of course, I'm in Montana. I get some care locally. That's fine. But there's some specialty care that I can't get here that I need to be able to get in Seattle. And I've felt a very real pressure on that in like trying to do some annual care and other specialty care that I got. So for me, it's a very real situation. And one other thing that we haven't touched on, it's unfortunate, but one thing that I noticed when I first got back into a local VA system here, I was looking to go get some counseling. I wouldn't acknowledge at that time that it might be PTSD related or however you want to refer to it. I wasn't going to go to some counselor in a hospital or go to a mental health place, but I could go to the VA. And you've got a large number of veterans who are even reluctant to go to a VA because they're embarrassed that they might need to go somewhere and get help. But they will go to a VA, but they're not going to go to some place and try to seek help. And if you don't have that place at the VA where you can go talk to other veterans and hang out and share some of that, you're going to lose a huge chunk of that. And I think we're talking about something like that
Yeah, not talking about you're not talking about the community aspects. And one of the things when you and I were talking on the phone earlier today, Bob, is I heard very clearly in your voice that you get a lot of value out of the shared experience with your fellow spinal cord injuries, the groups you formed that around the VA. I mean, I think what people they forget, it's not just a hospital. Okay, I think when we have to understand that the VA is a community for veterans, many veterans desperately need that community. They're isolated as it is. Perhaps they're formerly homeless. The VA does provide a sort of almost in many ways an inadvertent, but also a vertent community center for a lot of you guys. I imagine in a place like Billings, that's an sort of an unrealized portion of it, isn't it?
What was that again?
It's sort of a community. Read the comments. Yeah, it's almost a community center in a lot of ways for you guys, right? A lot of veterans, especially older veterans, it's a great way for you to see other veterans, connect and see other people, right? Otherwise, it's an isolated life, isn't it?
It is, and it's I was actually surprised at one point when I realized there were veterans that could go to the Veterans Community Center, the Vet Center. Yeah. They couldn't get themselves to go to the vet clinic because the vet clinic was directly related to the government, and that was intimidating. So they could go to the vet clinic, the vet center, and seek help there. And so the same group of veterans now really kind of move around from kind of a self-appointed coffee clutch where we all sit around and support each other and help out where we can. Several nonprofit veterans groups that function here in Billings that support the community, whether it's Warriors Wishes Montana or the Meat Locker, Dog Tag Buddies. All of these are local supported and local run veterans organizations, and they all come together at the vet center. And we used to get together at the vet's clinic. We don't get together at the vet's clinic anymore because we can't find someone to fund or to run the mental health center at the vet clinic. So it's a very real current situation. If there's more cutbacks, I'm not sure what's going to happen at that point.
Wow. Well, thanks, Bob.
And
Kayla.
And thank you very much for sharing that. And I'm so glad that you went to get help for mental health concerns. And, somebody commented, I saw a comment pop up on the screen, somebody who waited for decades to reach out and look for help from their PTSD, for their PTSD. It is hard. I wouldn't admit it for years because my spouse had severe PTSD and I was able to function. So good enough, even though I'm like functioning like by gripping as hard as I could. And, wait, maybe I can actually try to be happy instead of just functional and super high strung. And one of the things that we talked about before, Fred, that's so insidious, some of these Heritage Foundation plans that they're putting forward and may then try to implement include things like, oh, if you don't apply for benefits for a condition within X number of years, what was it, within 10 years, then forget it. There are conditions that don't develop for decades. No. There are a lot of us who won't admit that we're struggling with our mental health for a long time. So we may be completely screwed. I think that's a safe word to say, right? And the other, they also are saying, oh, well, some of these conditions were only tenuously related to service or not related to service. Like you are betraying that you don't even understand how this works.
Right.
Because to get disability compensation, you have to show that you have a condition, right? A doctor has to say like, yes, you have this condition. And you also have to prove that it's related to your military service. Those things have to intersect. If like I broke my ankle after I got out of the Army, if I get arthritis in that ankle, like VA is not going to give me service connection for that. It's not related to my military service. You have to be able to prove that the condition is related directly or secondarily to your military service to be able.
And it's hard to do. It's not an easy process. People keep saying, "Oh, people game." It's like, okay, it's not that easy to do that.
It's actually quite hard. And getting that service-connected disability rating is the way that many, many people, probably maybe most still, are able to gain access to VA healthcare. Right? Like not all veterans are eligible for VA healthcare. Mm-hmm. That's another kind of like myth that folks have that any vet can just walk in. It's been gradually expanding as people see how good VA outcomes are. So, all post 9/11 vets like may get a certain amount of care for a certain number of years, and they keep expanding, trying to make it easier and easier. PACT Act really opened the aperture as well. But not all vets qualify for care. Having a disability related to your service is a way to open the door to that care. And so you see these efforts to chip away at that, shrink the number of folks who are eligible for care, find ways to try to pretend that our conditions weren't actually caused by the government when they were. Like this is it's a dangerous path that we're on. We should all be very, very cautious.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the thing. It is. That's such a big thing. I'm not afraid to tell my story. It took me a good 12 years to think, okay, maybe I have PTSD. And everybody in my life is like, no shit, dude. I mean, literally, it's like, I had lost men in combat in Desert Storm. 2 of my men were killed. I lost my Turvers beheaded because he worked for me. I mean, these things, they pile up. We started calling it survivor's guilt at some point. And so, when I finally did go to the VA and my PTSD, and there's a form. Some people understand this process. You fill out forms, okay, and it's all online, thank God now. But when you go to see this psychiatrist, who is either a VA psychiatrist or a contractor, they have this form they fill out, and there's tell us about your trauma event, and you got to sit there and go through the shit that's been screwing you up since 1990, and have a discussion, and it ain't fun. And a lot of veterans don't want to. It's not some easy thing. I somebody say the other day, oh, PTSD is such an easy thing to fake. Pardon my language, but fuck that. It is not. You don't fake PTSD. It's like, it's just. I'm sorry, it's just not how it works. And so, the guy did the paperwork, and I was really, the VA is so different than it was before. I literally had a guy from the VA call me, and I had filled out the paperwork for Gulf War syndrome wrong. It's a long story, but you don't, Gulf War syndrome is not a thing. You have symptoms that are tied to Gulf War syndrome, and I had reversed it. So anyway, he personally called me, and Bob, can you imagine this in 1975? A guy called me, said, I'm from the VA, and you filled the form out wrong. Let's fill this out right. And while we're talking, he says, by the way, he says to me, I saw your paperwork on the PTSD, and I'm so sorry. He goes, he was an NCO himself in the military. He says, I can't believe you had to deal with those things, and I'm just want to tell you, you're going to get 100% because of that. It's like, and it meant a lot to me, and it's a very different VA than the VA that I dealt with in 2010 when I retired from the Army. There's been so much improvement in the last 14 years and 10 years especially, and to go backwards on that would be. I think we're probably going to start kind of wrapping things up and let you guys go. Any last thoughts, Kayla, before I kick you out of here?
One other thing that I'll share, having been in a lot of VA hospitals when I was a VA employee, that has just stuck with me. A couple things actually that I'll share that have stuck with me. One is the sports clinics. VA does a summer sports clinic, a winter sports clinic, a tea tournament, which is like golf. They do wheelchair games. These efforts to get veterans with disabilities to be able to participate in sports, and it can be really life altering to say, oh, I can keep doing things that I didn't know I could do. And for me to see, a woman veteran, double amputee, learning to surf, like that's incredible. You're not going to get that in the private sector. That's something VA does. And VA employees are collaborating with nonprofits like Bob was talking about to make things like that happen for veterans. It is incredibly meaningful and powerful. It's meaningful to veterans. It's meaningful to volunteers. It's meaningful to VA employees. Over 30% of VA employees are veterans themselves. When we're talking about getting rid of those jobs, we're talking about making veterans unemployed, which I think is also bad. They also care and are passionate. And I'm going to close with something that to me demonstrates a little bit about the passion that they bring to the job that, again, I don't think you're going to see anywhere else. I had the deep honor of being in a VA hospital on the day that a veteran had passed. And as they were transporting the veteran's body out of the hospital on a hospital gurney covered in a flag, every VA employee in the building at the time lined the halls and saluted. and like everyone's crying, and it's deeply meaningful. These employees care. They could be making potentially more money in the private sector if they're doctors or healthcare workers, but they're doing this because they care, and they have a commitment to our veterans. They have a commitment to our country. And again, this is a system that is worth fighting for tooth and nail.
That's great. Bob, I wanted to close with one point, and I'll let you talk, is you got your injury in training, right? I mean, I've also seen this chirping about, well, really only combat veterans should, that got injured in combat should get veterans care. But our training is hard. You're a special operations guy. We joke about combat football. I got most of I would say that half my injuries in my body are from, like, my shoulders screwed up because I played rugby on the Schofield Barracks rugby team. But that's how we train. We train hard, right? Your injury was a training injury, and it doesn't matter, right? You were serving at the time, you were training for war, and you got injured, right?
Sir, along those lines. So, no, I wasn't in combat at that time. I mean, I had spent my combat time.
Yeah.
If you're in a combat unit, or maybe any unit, but I'll just speak to the experience. I was in an infantry unit at a time when things were pretty tense. North Vietnamese were doing their final takeover of Vietnam, and the general was making a real attempt to get our entire division, the 2nd Division, shipped to Vietnam to try to stop it. You live with this energy.
Yeah.
You get off work at 5 o'clock. You go downtown to the Ville outside Camp Casey, and that was the birth of the combat sports program, was to try to get rid of that energy so that we didn't go downtown to the Ville in Tondashan and kill each other, because that soldiers were killing each other. The racial situation existed back then, as it might now. I don't know. I expect it not. Anyhow, he created the combat sports system as an outlet for the mental and physical preparedness that you get yourself up for getting ready to go into combat.
Yeah.
So you're prepared for all of that. You're carrying that around. And that was the type of football game that it was. Should I not receive service-connected compensation because I wasn't actually in combat? I feel kind of strange saying no, except that I realize that a majority of these injuries don't occur in combat. But there's not a whole lot of the fine line. There isn't a fine line that you can realistically draw. Yeah. Something that we've missed in our discussion here, maybe others have had it, the number of survivors in especially these last wars since 9/11 compared to those who would have died. You people, you younger veterans, you all survived situations that maybe even in Vietnam we wouldn't have. So we got a lot of people out here who survived really nasty situations. And I'll try to make this quick. I don't know how I'm going to fit it in. My dad's a Korean War vet. And he was shot up pretty badly in Korea. And then stayed and spent, I think, 27 years in the Army. And he was still, 50%. It wasn't until sometime late 90s or 2000 that I managed through the PVA, Paralyzed Veterans of America, to get him rightfully rated as 100% service connected. And it was at that point that he began to receive that compensation that compensated him for injuries he had lived with. So, that's what, 1950 he was injured, and there was 50 years later, he's still alive, and he deserved that. And I think people ought to think long and hard before they think that we can actually just cut off all the veterans who have tried to make this conversation possible.
Wow. My dad's a World War II vet, same situation. Never applied. And I finally asked him, I said, why have you never applied? He goes, well, you know, other guys need it more. I'm like, it's not
My dad was like,
it's not like a pie, Dad. Yeah, it's like, it's not a pie. We don't get a piece of it. You know, it's a bucket. You know, but Kayla, you got the last word. Then I'm going to cut you guys off.
I just want to say, you know, to Bob's point and to yours, part of the reason that we've been seeing these growing costs is that VA is doing a better job at outreach.
Right.
And doing a more fair job at granting benefits when they are deserved, and moving away from the old model that many Vietnam vets like Bob have fought to improve, for that my generation is benefiting from, when they believed for so many years that the policy was delay, deny until they die, right? And now we are in a new era where folks have fought so hard to improve things, and grant rates are much higher, and it's a less antagonistic relationship now between veterans and VA. And VA is actively reaching out to veterans and trying to get them to come in and get them to apply and get them to use the benefits they've earned through their honorable service. And to then punish us for the success of those efforts is bonkers. Congress has expanded benefits because they believe that the government should, they believe in a you broke it, you buy it policy. And we really don't want to renege on that at this point.
No.
Here we are. With that, I really appreciate you. Man, what a great conversation. Bob, thank you for taking time. We found you. Kayla, appreciate you always being here. Thanks so much, guys. And I look forward to talking to you again and staying in touch.
Thank you.
Man, what a conversation, huh? You know, we're so blessed at VoteVets that, you know, we have a guy at VoteVets named Rick Hegdahl. And Rick is our guy that kind of coordinates our veteran outreach. And when we're putting together a show, so JJ and I will get an idea for a discussion like this, and we'll go into our chat and say, I need a veteran who could talk to us about his care at the VA. And then an hour or two later, Rick's like, I got a guy, I got a lady. and we'd be lost in that. And that says a lot about the VoteVets staffing team. I'm so impressed by working with a team that cares so much about our veterans and cares about their care, cares about supporting them and the people who are trying to support them, both in elected and others, and the policies around them. So if you want to learn more about what we do at VoteVets, I'd love you to go to votevets.org. You can find all the information about it. There's two very key buttons I always tell you about in the show. And by the way, it's so wonderful to see so many regulars here, and say hi, regulars. We love seeing you. We're going to do more shows, but two buttons I want to tell you about. One is, of course, donate. Without you clicking that donate button and supporting our efforts, all this is moot. All this beautiful stuff has to get paid for, and we appreciate you. Plus, we're working hard to elect veterans for Congress, for hire. Abigail Spanberger's running for governor of Virginia. We got two veterans running for governor of New Jersey. It's an exciting time. We believe we're going to try and get more of our veterans elected. But on top of that, the programs like this, the outreach, we do fly-ins to DC for special issues just like this. I assure you, when the time comes that Congress takes up the idea of legislation to cut our veterans benefits, VoteVets is going to be there, and we're going to be there with your support. So if you believe in this mission and we're going to fight, we'll fly veterans from all the, I've done one myself 2 years ago. We had one about Ukraine funding. They flew me into DC. It put me up. We met with congressmen. We met with senators, and we were able to help that process be shaped. That's what we do at VoteVets. Is so unique. Two, there's another button there. I love you. That's our action button. Take action, right? Just on the screen. That's how when people ask you, how can I help? Click that button, folks. That's where you get involved like Bob. That's where you get involved like Kayla. That's where you get involved like me and can be a part of the things we're doing. You can find other veterans in your area to organize with. That's how we're going to get through this period, you guys. I know a lot of people are scared, a little bit worried. We get involved. We organize together, and look, it's not even going to be partisan sometimes. You know, we're not even talking about, I haven't used the words Democrat, Republican. We're going to have to work together, veterans together, supporters together, to fight for the right policies, regardless of what our party might say behind our name. And so that's what we're going to do, and that's what you're going to do. So we could use your help. So don't give up the ship. Don't surrender. As the guy Timothy Snyder says, don't obey in advance. And we're not obeying in advance. We're having these shows. We're having these conversations because we want you you to be informed. We want you to be able to tell your friends and family and your fellow veterans about what's going on, and so that we can work together. So thank you for joining us here. The biggest thing I got to tell you, if you're on YouTube, you got to subscribe to the Vote Vets button. Just subscribe. It's free. You can't beat the price. Subscribe. Let's get more people involved. If you're watching us on our social channels, be sure you follow us. You tell your friends. You share this content. It matters. We'll be doing a lot more. In the end, we really appreciate all of you and your support. Lastly, I am Fred Wellman. As I mentioned, I'm a 22-year Army veteran. I'm the host of Online Vote Vets, my producer, JJ Jorgensen, who's the man behind the scenes that keeps us going. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Kayla and Bob. We will see you guys again soon.